Thanks. Well, hi, everybody. So as a few of us, just if there's something I say and you think I don't understand that or whatever, just shout out. I think that's the easiest thing to do. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use slides for this. And so let me just try and share my screen. See if that works. Does that work? Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is really two main things. To talk a little bit about the religion and belief landscape, an update, so I think a number of people have know quite a lot about this, and also look at what's a little bit about what's happening in the Church of England on that. And then head off into a related subject, which is this question about values. And based on a set of talks done by Linda Woodhead I think it was last May, and I'll explain that when we get there. And it raises some questions for us as humanists, but also for other people as well. And I think it's some very interesting thinking. So let's start with the question of the religion and belief landscape. And in order to get into this, it begs the question, what is religion? And this is important when you look at data to understand how this can be disaggregated. So there are lots of definitions of what a religion is, but this is from a sort of sociological point of view. And it's got the simple thing, because I'm a bad memory, is the 3 Bs. It's got 3 dimensions to it. Belief is the obvious one, and it's the one that often humanists make the mistake of identifying religion and belief, and that is, I think, is an error. Belief is obviously very important, but there are other things going on as well. Another element is belonging or identity or sense of community. So this is both personal and social. And then the third one is behavior, which is, of course, practice, religious practice, but it's also how you're, something just coming in the waiting room, I'll admit them. How you live your life in the world. And it's important just to have those 3 dimensions in mind when you look at the data and to think about this whole subject. Because the main data that we've got, the best set of data we've got, is from the British Social Attitude Survey. And it's the best set of data we've got because it's been run every year since 1983. And it asks a 2-stage question. And the 2 stages are, do you regard yourself as belonging to a particular religion? And if the person says yes, then the question says, okay, which one? There's 2 steps. It's much better than the question in the census, which leads to a very distorted result, because the question the census asks is one question, which is, what is your religion? Which has got a sort of presupposition that you ought to have one. So a lot of people, particularly older people, say, well, I don't know, I suppose I'm C of E, so that means Christian. So it tends to overstate Christianity and understate no religion. Anyway, so the British Social Attitude Survey is a sample, so it's unlike the census, which everybody does. And this is the picture you get. I've sort of smoothed it out a bit using 3-year averages. And it's lumpy because it's sampled, but you can see there's a very, very clear picture here. And this is the important sort of thing to have in mind. So you can see that there are 2 lines there, the bright red one going up and the browny colored one going down. The bright red one going up is the people that say to that question, no. Okay. Now going back to the 3 Bs, the question is about belonging. So it's about the identity, belonging part of it. It doesn't ask anything about belief, and it doesn't ask you anything about behavior. So you can't tell anything from it about whether people go to church or whether they believe in God or anything. It's about their identity. You can see the brown line, the mirror image of that is the Church of England line. And you can see that that is dropping extremely seriously from in this period from the mid-80s to now. You know, it's gone from nearly 40% to about 12%. That in, you know, for one of the great institutions of state is pretty catastrophic. The other lines, if you, let me, if I make this, can you, by the way, if you're using, if you're finding that people's thumbnails are getting in the way of the slides, you can click the little underline at the top of the thumbnail thing, and that'll hide the thumbnails, because if you're anything like me, the bit I just put up was invisible because of the thumbnails. And because the Church of England is such a big part of the religious landscape, it has a big part on this overall picture of religion belief. So that the people who look at the British Social Attitude Survey, the sociologists that have commented on it, who are specialists in this area, say if you look at the average, 2 non-religious parents successfully transmit their lack of religion to almost all their children. If you've got 2 religious parents, you've got a 50-50 chance of passing on your faith to your children, and 1 religious parent only does half as well as 2. So in other words, what we're seeing here is not the effect of people losing their faith as they get older. What the effect is of faith not being passed from one generation to the next. So that was their main message. Okay, but it's skewed by the fact that this huge effect of the Church of England. If you take away the Church of England and the non-religious, you can see the other lines are much more even. There's not nearly as much going on. And in fact, a couple of the lines are going up. One is the other Christian, and that's had a growth. There's lots of things going on in there, but it includes growth in the evangelical churches, independent churches, charismatic Pentecostal churches. And the other line that's going up is the pale blue one, which is the Muslim line, and that's about 6% now, and it's predominantly young population, so that's likely to continue going up. The Catholic line has stayed up reasonably well, but it's in slow decline. Obviously, that was very much affected by immigration in the 1990s, where a lot of people came from Poland from Catholic backgrounds. You can see that this sort of huge decline in religion as a whole is a bit of a simplification. It's really about the Church of England. Other things are doing quite differently. In fact, the fastest growing religious denomination in the country is this one, which is a Nigerian-based church, the Redeemed Christian Church of God, and that's growing very, very quickly. So these are Black African churches in particular. In London, a lot of them very strong, but this one in particular at universities as well. There's a complicated picture. Now, focusing at the Church of England, because that's where the big thing is going on, as you can see. This is the chart that should be keeping the Archbishop of Canterbury awake at night. It's looking beneath those the data we've just seen, looking at the ages. And what you can see is that while if people in the over 75 cohort, 1 in 3 people identify with the Church of England, but in the 18 to 24 cohort, it's only 1%. In fact, the data is under 1%, is rounded to 1%. So this is, means that line is going to keep going downwards because, the older cohort is dying off and the younger ones coming through. So it's a very, very tough situation for the Church of England. And if you can try and do a sort of forecast of this, all forecasts are wrong by definition, but looking ahead to the sort of 2040s, given that most of the people who will be alive in 2040 are alive now, so we know what they think, you can see that the Church of England will probably then be around, 5 to 7%. I put 6 here. It'll be probably slightly smaller or the same size as Catholics. Be small. Both of them will be smaller than the Muslim line, and all of those will be smaller than the other Christian line. Whereas about nearly 60% of people will be non-religious, no religious identity. So it raises a lot of questions. Can a 6% church remain the established church of the country? Seats in the House of Lords? What about all the schools and things? There's a lot of questions that will inevitably come up as this decline continues. So and to be fair, it's a very tough situation for a lot of good people in the Church of England. It's not an easy situation for them to be in. Now, at the top of the Church of England is predominantly evangelical in its outlook, in particular the two archbishops, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Archbishop of York. Here's the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell, and he came up with a scheme last year that they were talking about 10,000 new lay-led churches in the next 10 years. So this is huge. This is saying there's going to be around 3 new churches every day for 10 years, roughly. Very, very ambitious. In fact, so ambitious, a lot of people think it's nuts. It's not going to happen. And here is a view from Angela Tilby, who some people may have, she's on the Thought for the Day on Radio 4 sometimes, from the other wing of the church. And she's basically saying this is a state of corporate psychosis, false consciousness, it's all crazy. And she also says that the type of Christianity that is often advocated for this is very different from what you're used to in the Church of England. And you can see a sort of picture of the sort of thing we're talking about there. So, there's a struggle going on. There's a review I picked out, it came out just a couple of weeks ago, of their Strategic Development Fund. Lots of things going on to try and fight back, of course. But if you look at their plan to get new converts, tough period with COVID, of course, but they had a plan to get nearly 90,000 new converts or new disciples, the evangelical language used, between 2014 and last year. And they've actually got 12,000 or 13,000. How you measure these is very questionable, of course. Are they really new or whatever it is? But the cost of this is unbelievable. That because the numbers are much lower, it means each one of those has cost them 6,000 quid. So this is really quite desperate stuff. Now, in the meantime, of course, the Church of England is facing some other very difficult things. They too, not as serious as the Catholic Church, but had the sexual abuse scandal, the Alexis J report, and had the same corporate failures where the institution was protected rather than the children. There's a big issue of racism. That ethnic minorities are not being included so much, and that's actually a very important issue given where the growth area is in Christianity. There was this idea that came up last year that you'd perhaps have different sorts of bishops, and as well as just having bishops that cover a particular area, as like the senior managers in the organisation, you'd have one that might cover a topic, and one of the ideas was the Brexit bishop. This idea went down like a lead balloon with a lot of the professionals in the Church of England. You can see some very controversial, very difficult things to manage here. And one of the other very interesting things that's going on in the Church of England is we're looking at it from the point of view of the Church of England. But actually, of course, the Anglican churches are an international organisation. And what's becoming clear is the bits outside England are going to be much bigger than the bit in England, looking at the data we've just seen. And so one of the questions is, should the overseas churches have more say in choosing who the Archbishop of Canterbury is going to be? Very controversial idea, but you can see that's quite a logical thing. So the whole character of the thing is likely to change over the coming years in very radical ways, accompanying this really precipitous decline. Now, that does raise some other issues, not only for the church itself and for the things that it does, and obviously there's a lot of good people in the church, but there's also a question about shared heritage. Lots of the most beautiful buildings in the country are churches. About 40,000 church buildings, 16,000 of them are Anglican, and nearly half of them are Grade 1 listed buildings. So what's going to happen to all of these buildings as the church declines? And a lot of them are already closed. And the church, right, understandably perhaps says, our job is to bring people to Jesus and save souls. It's not to be the curators of a lot of old buildings, very beautiful though they may be. If the building ceases to be functioning for its original intention as a church, then the Church of England will probably not put any money in it. So what's going to happen to that? Now, the way I look at it, this is part of our shared heritage. Everybody in the country has a sort of ownership of these lovely buildings. There are various charities. I've actually put my money where my mouth is on the bottom one, called the Friends of Friendless Churches, because it's the only one that's not sort of entangled with what the Church of England itself is doing. But for people who are involved in the Church of England, there are these other trusts as well. That problem is only going to get worse and worse. The Church of England is actually a very rich organisation. It's got billions of pounds under the Church Commission is in charge of, but they're not about to spend those billions on new roofs on medieval buildings that are no longer churches. So who is going to? Big question for everybody, I think. So I just talked about that. So big problem, and I think a common problem for us all. Now, let's look at another bit of Christianity in this country. So this is the second largest denomination, bearing in mind that the big growth areas in non-denominational Christianity. So this is a survey done of young British Catholics, and just focus on the green lines, because the green lines are young people who identify themselves as Catholics. So this is bearing in mind the belonging bit. Okay, so they're not just people who say been to a Catholic school or something. They're people who self-identify as Catholics. And this was a look at beliefs. So this is looking at one of the other B's. And what the interesting thing about this, if you look at it, look at the scale. The scale doesn't even go up to 50%. And you can see the first one, this thing you think, as an outsider, you think, well, this is pretty bread and butter Catholicism, Christianity. God created the world and involved in what happens to the world now. Well, among these self-identifying young Catholics, under 40% think that's true. Okay. You can see for yourselves, God created in the world. Well, that's a fallback position. Only 12% think that. I believe in higher power, but not a personal God. Well, quite a lot. 1 in 5 think about that. I don't believe in God or any higher spiritual power. In other words, I'm an atheist. You may not call yourself that. About 5% think of that, or not sure. And so an agnostic position. And 27% think of that as well. So what you can see from this is that we've looked so far at the belonging bit and the decline of the Church of England and the questions that raises, but among the people where the belonging bit is clear, where they do have an identity, you can't read across from that to what their beliefs are, because it's often not what you think. Now, it does raise another question, of course, and particularly true for Catholicism. When we're thinking about this stuff, Catholicism is the most institutionalized church, the most powerful, largest religious organization in the world. But I think it's very helpful when we're thinking about, particularly about Catholicism, but applies to some extent to the Church of England as well, and to other organized faiths, that there's a differentiation between the institution, the Catholic Church, with the Pope at the top and everything. There's Catholicism defined in the Catechism of the Church of England. It's very, very clear what it says. And then there's the people who identify as Catholics. Okay? And they're three quite distinct things. And when we're thinking about this stuff, it's very important to try and just aggregate it. As we've just seen, you can't, there is a lack of coincidence between the teaching and the people, for instance. Ask the people about what they think about the institution, a lot of them are very critical of it. So it's, and particularly following the child abuse scandal. This is very complex picture. Now, if we step back a little bit further and look at religiosity, so this is how people feel about themselves. They consider themselves religious. And so this is what you can see is that the number of people in the Church of England who consider themselves very religious on the left-hand side is actually quite small, but somewhat religious, nearly half. There's a lot of not very, committed, not very religious people in the other half. Much higher religiosity among Catholics, and similarly among other Christians, and even higher among non-Christian religious people. None of them are 100%. And the non-Christian religious people, obviously it includes Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, everybody. But numerically, by far and away the largest group among the non-Christians are Muslims. That's the far and away the largest non-Christian group. So people in the non-Christian group, particularly Muslims, if they continue to identify with that faith, they take it a lot more seriously. So the decline is in the least religious. Another thing to bear in mind is ethnicity. So 90% of people who say they're not religious, who say no to that question about belonging, are white people. Whereas 80% of people who are not white British do identify with the faith. That's double the percentage of white people that do. So that's a challenge for those of us who are humanists and are non-religious, that it's very easy to, you look around and you think, well, where are all the non-white people? And it makes it very challenging for people who are non-religious and non-white to feel at home, because they don't see people like them around. And that's one reason why there's a group, which a number of people probably know, called the Association of Black Humanists. And you think, well, why do you need an Association of Black Humanists? And that's the reason why, because the experience of being a Black humanist is very different, because talking to one of them who was background is Seventh-day Adventist, he said, well, all of my relations, all my family group and everything, that's a huge part of their lives, and I can no longer sincerely participate in that. That's a big thing for me, so I need to find another home for that. And so that's a challenge for us, is to make sure we're welcoming for those people. And it's also a challenge when we're saying, well, how do we understand each other between the religious and non-religious, that often that division coincides with an ethnic division as well. So we need to be very, wary of that, very aware of it. So looking at the future trends, pulling all that together, it's likely that the no religion line is going to keep going up and the Church of England line is going to keep going down. Remember the chart with the ages of people. It's also likely that the Church of England is going to become more evangelical as it shrinks, because the people who are most serious about their faith are going to be the stayers. Okay. So, and the senior leadership of the Church of England is already more evangelical. So the bit that's going to sort of boil off as it shrinks is going to be the people who are less strong about their faith. So the character of the Church of England is likely to change. Also means that the average religiosity of people who identify with a religion is likely to go up for the same reason. That the people who are not very religious, it's fine not to be religious in our society. There's no social pressure to be religious for many people. In some groups there is, and that's what makes it very difficult for people to leave some religions. But on average, it's not. So it's, you know, so the people that remain are going to be more serious about it. And the ethnic minority proportion among the people who are religious, the white-dominated C of E is the bit that's declined. Okay. So there's some challenges you can see, some obvious things lying beneath all of this. Now, we're now going to begin to talk about values. Let me just finish this. No, actually, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to stop sharing here and just see if are there any things that anybody wants to sort of raise before we go into the sort of second part of this? So I'll carry on. Speak now or forever hold your... Okay, I'll keep going.
Jeremy, can I just ask one question?
Yeah.
The original, you know, that graph that you showed, well, all of them, they're based on, is it 18 to 35-year-olds? Was it something, or 24 to 35-year-olds?
With the one with the very 1%?
The one, just the main graph, we're going up and down, you know.
No, that main graph is for everybody. So that's a representative sample. Yeah.
And then the prediction for the future was based on a younger cohort of people. Presumably, yes, they're going to be the people who are going to grow up in the next 20 years. And
yes, so by looking at the age distribution, what you can do is then say, okay, project forward to what the average is going to look like in 20 years' time, because we know what the age split is now. Right. So you can do a crude projection on that basis. Yeah.
Okay, right. Thanks for that. Yeah, great.
So it's not perfect, but it's probably not bad. You know, it's qualitatively been the right direction. Okay, so I'll go on if I can try and find where I was before. Right. So now another thing we've already looked at is about the beliefs that, remember, those young Catholics had, which seem to diverge quite a lot from the what you would think of as classic beliefs from of a Catholic. You know, so they're much more diverse in their beliefs and not maybe what you expect, which is, I think, a lesson to those of us who think that when somebody says they're a Muslim or a Catholic or something, that you know what they think. You've got no idea what they think, really. It could be anything. So, but this is now looking at something a bit different about moral attitudes. And it just happens we've got a lot of data on Catholics and British Catholics. So this is some data published, as you can see, last year by two Catholic academics, Stephen Bullivant and Ben Clements at St Mary's University. And they asked some very simple questions. They asked a set of moral behaviors, and then they said, is it a sin? Or isn't it a sin, or does it depend on the situation? And they asked this of a representative sample of British Catholics. Okay, so this is no age split. This is a representative sample. It's quite a significant sample. So this is, you know, pretty good data. So engage in homosexuality, in homosexual behavior. So this isn't just about attitudes towards homosexuality. This is about engaging in homosexual behavior. No, it is not a sin, 54%, and it depends, 10%. Under 30% said it is a sin. You have to look at the catechism. Remember, we're going back to Catholicism and the Catholic Church. You know, pretty clear what it says in there. Be in a sexual relationship outside marriage. you can see, no, it's not a sin, 51%, depends, further 14%. Again, roughly 30% saying, yeah, it's a sin. Use of contraceptives. You've only got to look at the population growth in Italy to know that most Catholics don't stick to this one. And, you know, huge figure. Getting a divorce, big issue in Catholicism, of course. Remember Henry VIII. No, it's not a sin, 2/3, and it depends a further 16%. Have an abortion, and this is the one that really surprised me. You know, all of the, and people feel very, very emotional about this. People who think this is sinful feel very strongly about it, and for understandable reasons. But actually, they're in a minority. No, it's not a sin, 42%. It depends, 24%. And another one, which is rather specialist Catholic thing about getting remarried after a divorce without first getting an annulment. Again, same picture. So what you can see is that there's a sort of hardcore, don't use contraceptives, don't get a divorce is sinful. There's a slightly, you know, traditional view of about a third of people, which is that homosexuality and sex outside marriage definitely sinful. But there's everybody else where the views are completely different to what you would expect from, you know, about what the Catholic Church is teaching is. So this is giving us a clue about something, and it's about values into the Linda Woodhead piece. Now, Linda Woodhead, you may not, people don't know her. She was the professor of the sociology of religion at Lancaster University. She's now at Birmingham. This is the Cadbury Lectures, so this is a series run by Birmingham University. She's a big cheese in the world of academia and study of religion and belief in the country and indeed globally. She's, you know, a very distinguished academic. And so what I'm going to show, she did 4 lectures. Okay, see the split here. I put the link here, and it's, you know, worth watching them. They're very interesting. She's a good speaker. She does it in a very informal way. And what I've done is just sort of pick out some things which are particularly relevant, I think, to this audience. I thought were of particular interest and maybe challenge to us. But this is her thesis. Is what she says, that values are the new religion. Just seen about the Catholics is a bit of a clue to might suggest maybe she's onto something. She starts with historical perspective, and she talks about moral rearmament. This was a thing started before the Second World War, about, you know, that the world was going to pop, so that morals were declining, and we should stiffen up and resolve and become, you know, this is about Christian morality. That carried on, and can anybody say who they think these people are? Who's the guy on the left? Unmute. Anybody?
Richard, Hank Marvin, Malcolm Muggeridge, and what's her name?
Mary Whitehouse.
It's Mary Whitehouse, yeah. That is indeed. So they did the same idea of the moral rearmament thing, that nationwide festival of lights. This was fighting back against the what happened in the 60s, you know, and in particular, it was fighting back against this was about gay liberation, it was called at the time, and so this is a big, you know, a big fight, moral fight, and of course, by Mary Whitehouse and co. lost that fight, and a number of reactions to that. of course, some of them were included within the religious groups. And so liberal Christianity responded by, this was Don Cupid, who, famous liberal Christian theologian, was talking about saying, well, how do we, we shouldn't ignore how science works, which is about critical thinking, and purge what's been proved wrong in the past, and apply the same thinking to religious ideas. So this is quite revolutionary from a theological point of view. Strand is still there within Christianity and also within most religious communities as well. It's by and large a minority strand. But then there was another thing which sort of gave this thing a huge, this direction, a huge impetus, of course, which was that the ability to defend the high moral ground was completely undermined by the child abuse scandals, which were so terrible. And the place where that is more visible than anywhere else, of course, is in Ireland. And this is this book about the end of a special relationship. So these were traumatic things for the churches. Linda Woodhead and Andrew Brown wrote a book about this, and Linda Woodhead herself is very critical of the Church of England, even though she herself is a Christian, a liberal Christian. So her thesis is that there was a Christian ethic in the past, and the Christian ethic she summarizes as give your life. It was about self-sacrifice. Turn the other cheek, love your neighbor, but give your life. To a new ethic which she labeled live your life. Now, you can argue whether she's got these right, but this is how she looks at it. And she says that this moral fall of institutional Christianity is being replaced by individual moral responsibility. People are their own agents. You have to think through your own morality. And, this is about being good without God, which to a humanist, of course, will all sound very, very familiar. And this agape ethic, which is about unconditional love, a very characteristic of Christianity, is challenged by all sorts of things, including feminism and by moral and religious diversity. And what's emerged is a new set of shared liberal values, not universally shared, but widely shared. And she, to sort of support this, she's some sociological research. So somebody doing an MA at Lancaster did some interviews with Catholic women in their 60s, in the early 2000s. And this is one, what you should do, you should fulfill your duty as a good Catholic girl. Commit yourself to your family. You sublimate your own desires for the greater good of everybody else, and you just got to on with it. That's the give your life ethic. And it was also, of course, carried through into some both nationalistic imagery associated with wartime, for the First World War and the Second World War, the idea of self-sacrifice, religious imagery used in this. It's interesting that, we're not seeing that in the war in Ukraine now, but it was very much characteristic of it was a quasi-religious duty, sacrifice, personal sacrifice. And she says that's being replaced by something which is much more individualistic. So, your sort of job is to discover and become the best version of you. Be real. Show kindness and respect not only to other people but also to yourself, and treat other people well, whether they're different or not. Try and leave the world a better place than you find it. This is the live your life ethic. And so it's moving from a basis of care on the basis of selfless service to mutual care and, appropriate reward. This is a more recent survey that she quoted, which was looking at young people in the UK. What do you think should come first? Caring for yourself, caring for others. Okay. And some people say caring for myself should come first. Smaller numbers said caring for others should come first. But the largest number by far said we've got to try and balance the two. Okay. You do look after yourself, but you also look after other people. That's a complete contrast to the give your life ethic. And, you know, we saw some of that in the first year of COVID in particular, and that attitude towards the NHS and people making, you know, the sacrifice of people in the NHS, including some people who died as a result of working in the NHS and catching COVID when there was no protection against it. You know, we saw that people really did appreciate that. That was highly valued, but people also sought to look after themselves. And now, with these values, these strong set of values that's emerging, there are also anti-values as well, things that we generally think are very bad. The most obvious one is abuse. And, you know, I feel slightly nauseous when I see that picture of Jimmy Savile now. You know, I used to him when I was a child, actually, but anyway, but you know, now we know the truth, and it was terrible. So abuse has become a sort of really important sin because it damages us to people. And we've got new offences, which, you know, marital rape is an offence. Smacking now, just this week, you know, corporal punishment of children banned in Wales. Obviously, grooming, coercive control, all these things were never heard of before, or certainly were not regarded as you know, and they're, you know, some to a greater or lesser extent illegal now. So we've got anti-values, and socially, disrespect and kindness is, you know, we of course have plenty of that in our society, but the majority view is those are something which are disapproved of, and, you know, violating duties of care is disapproved of. We're quite risk averse in our society. The result of this is, of course, we've got a moral majority that has this liberal, with a small l, ethic. Okay? That's the majority view. But it also means, of course, we've got minority views that don't share these ethics, including religious minorities. And that doesn't mean that they're all in favour of abuse or, you know, marital rape or something, but they may have different views on some of the other issues. We're also seeing, and this is something perhaps less comfortable from the humanist point of view, there are people who are reacting against excessive, you know, rationality or rationalism. This is Linda Woodhead's view. Not sure I totally agree with it. But, you know, against the idea that we're just, you know, selfish genes, that humans are not moral agents and we're driven by instincts, you know, this extreme sort of neo-Darwinism, we're hardwired to do things, or that we, you know, that you can't question the need to drive up shareholder value if you're running a company, or follow the bottom line, always look at the numbers, you know, or defer to the experts, there's a bit of reaction against those, and you can actually see that in the corporate world as well. You know, although people have if you're running a company, you do have a duty to look after the money of your shareholders, but most companies have, you know, value statements which talk about all sorts of other things as well, because they're comprised of people who have liberal values, and they know the wider society has those liberal values. So there's a big change going on in that area as well, and she talks quite a lot about that in the lectures. Now, why have these new values become visible? And she said, well, one reason is because, go back to where we started, there's been a decoupling of values and religion. Look at that list of, you know, values of Catholics. You know, that would be unthinkable, you know, 50 years ago. There's been a decoupling of values and religion. There's been the big growth, as we know, been no religion and cultural pluralism. Okay. And we're much less deferential to hierarchy and roles. People are into personal choice and responsibility and identity. These are characteristics of modern Western culture. And that's why values have become more visible as well. And she points, we start becoming more values aware when we think things are up for grabs, when you think, I've got to fight my corner here because this is my value and it might be being taken away, or there's an opportunity for me to, a value which I have but I didn't think was something I could share in public, I can now do, and I'm going to get people to support it. So you get some difficulties as well. There's more diversity of values, and they have power. People have personal identity with values, and huge change, of course, because we've got online forums which enable people to argue about values, and people expect it to be, everyone thinks they were entitled to be heard and respected for who they are. This is the classic aspect of the live your life ethic, which he abbreviates to live your life. So, what results of that is you see the culture wars. Now, you can argue that often these are exaggerated, that the number of people who are actually engaged in them is quite limited, but there are significant things going on and genuinely difficult issues. Like the trans one is a very obvious one, where people are genuinely torn, and there are very strong views on both sides, and it's a tough issue to talk about. Now, I guess maybe some people here are school speakers. Anybody shout out if you're a school speaker?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if you go into a school, you see there are statements about values all over the place. Now, the government has an official set of British values, fundamental British values, the FBVs, which schools have a statutory duty to promote. See what they are. Now, the snag with them, of course, is people say, well, why call them British values? They're not British values. They're universal human values. And they also received a lot of criticism because they were came up in the wake of some challenges, particularly from some hardline Islamists. So people say, well, they're anti-Muslim stuff. When you look at them, of course, they're very hard to argue with. They're very reasonable values. Actually, when you go into schools, they will promote these things, but you see stuff like this, quite different, overlapping. And most schools have their own set of values. So values have become a big thing in education. And that means that's what this generation is growing up with, is that values are a big part of it. So it's not just something the corporate values that you stick on the wall and nobody takes any notice of. These are actually things that are talked about in schools and in school assemblies and stuff all the time. And there was a study done by another Linda Woodhead students about looking at this. And she looked at values and looked at did a word cloud, which words come up, and she looked at faith schools and non-faith schools. And the same word comes up at the top of both, respect. Respect comes, what's meant by this, I think, is respect for other people. You can see then there's a bit of difference between faith and non-faith schools, but not really that significant. So values are a big thing in education now, and so this idea is not going to go away. So in summary, what she's saying is, that we've had a flight, what she calls a flight from morality. What she means by that is we're not that people are less moral, but we flight from being told what morality is. People decide for themselves what's right and wrong. There's been a big shift in these personal values, and it's overwhelmed some of the religious values that people were held. That there's what she called value pluralism, value sediments. Sediments are things that were a value in the past and are still a value because they fit with the new structure anyway. Okay, and what we say is that she says there's an excess of moral values, that not all moral values are in play all the time, but they're lurking there, and if something happens, they get sort of brought into play. So there's this liberal moral majority, but there are moral minorities as well. People who think very sincerely that homosexuality is a sin, you know, that sex outside marriage is a sin. They're in a moral minority, but you know, they have a right to be heard. And if their own lives in line with their moral values. And she says it's got, you know, an implication, all of this has got an implication for all parts of society. You know? And it also increases the potential for conflict. Now, it's interesting, of course, that we've now got real hard-edged, you know, will bomb you type conflict, and that tends to blow a lot of these things out of the water. But, you know, when that's not there, there are real underneath conflicts. There's the, you know, the war on woke and things used for political ends. So this is her slide. We know a few implications that you know, we should understand more about values and their histories, including the values we, the liberal majority, have. She thinks there should be a lot more teaching about values in schools, and she sees that should be included in what's now currently called RE, religious education, or increasingly called education about religions, belief and values, and that we need better skills to discuss values and to talk about them without, you know, having a standoff. You know, we're all in this together. We all, you know, this is ethical issues. We're all in the same society, and we've got to make sure it works. So that's what Linda Woodhead's view is. So thinking about that, some questions for us as humanists, and for anybody else who's not a humanist, but I think similar things apply. Firstly, is it true to say that belief is only important in society insofar as it drives values and drives action? That it doesn't really matter whether somebody believes in God or doesn't believe in God. Okay, it does matter whether they are a kind person or they, you know, will give money to refugees or whatever it is. You know, what's important? Is it the value that's important rather than the belief? And on that, is this difference between liberal, small l, and non-liberal values, in fact, more significant in our society now than the difference between atheism or non-religion and religious beliefs? Is it more important? Now, we would, as a humanist, I'd say the majority, the shared liberal values, we would say are essentially humanist values. But of course, they're shared by lots of religious people as well. So is in fact, there's more common ground, and obviously I'm very active in dialogue, so you see this all the time, is there more common ground between a humanist, you know, most humanists, not all, and a liberal religious person, and a liberal religious person, and a fundamentalist from their own religion, split in a different way to the one we're used to? And to what extent should we as humanists move away from humanism being identified by contrast to religion, because that's how RE is done, categorized, but anyway, by contrast to religion, and should we really be talking about a liberal worldview which is shared alike by religious and non-religious people, identified in contrast to non-religious worldviews? Is that the most important thing? And then the challenge comes, should we do more to engage with those who have different values as opposed to different beliefs? I mean, you know, as a dialogue guy, last night I was at big event, local event, which I was involved in organising with the council, and we had people sitting around tables from different religions and beliefs, along with some humanists, and we had Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Catholics and everybody. And you know, it was great. It was very moving in some ways and powerful, and people were very open, and you know, there was a very great warmth in all things. But by and large, the people we were talking to were there because they are the sort of people who like to have those conversations. It's much harder to talk to the people who actually say that, you know, they don't want to talk to me as a humanist because they think, you know, atheism is the spawn of the devil, and you know, lock up your daughters. And we should be denied a voice in the public sphere and all of those things. Very hard to engage with that. And should we talk more overtly about values? You know, when we, as people going into schools and things, when we engage in dialogues, when we talk about schools, is this a thing that we ought to be, not saying we don't talk about the other stuff, but because they're important, and traditions and practice and things, but our values, something that should become much more into the foreground than it has hitherto. Okay, that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. That's really informative. So over to everybody else. I'm not going to ask any questions. I've already heard this talk once. It's lovely to hear it again. It sort of drives home some of the points I missed or didn't concentrate on. So over to everybody else.
No pressure then.
I might start, Jeremy. I think it's an excellent presentation, and it just rings so true to many experiences, certainly that I've had, and I assume it will be the case for other people as well. One of the things I always recall is when I talk to my daughters, you know, 30 years younger than me, roughly, and I tell them I'm a humanist, they describe it as religion for the non-religious. And that seems very much to fit in with where you're at. They don't see religion as playing any part in their life. They'll listen to religious people that have moral views and take them on board the same as they would any other person's views critically and so on. So your question for me, you asked at the end about the orientation. For me, if we're to engage with a younger demographic, I think we have to have these sort of discussions, because for large numbers of people, that's where they are, that's how they see the world. Many of those old battles perhaps have largely been won. Still some things going on about, you know, bishops in the House of Lords and religious schools and so on, but the real discussions in society today are far more oriented around values and what people think are right and wrong in relation to how you treat people, rather than, you know, what you've inherited from some religious belief. So I find your presentation very positive. I quite welcome it.
It's interesting though what your daughters say, that because obviously we wouldn't characterize humanism as a religion. Do they say that as a pejorative thing, do you think?
So they say it because humanists have ceremonies similar to religious groups. And that perhaps is the perception. When it comes to the values, they don't necessarily think of the values as humanist any more than religious. If they think it's you know, homosexuality is somebody's right if they want to be homosexual, they don't think of that as being a humanist principle. They just think of that as being, you know, that's part of life. That's what human beings should do.
Yeah.
The visible piece, I think, for them is perhaps the ceremonies and some of the more belief side of things.
Yeah, because we like philosophizing and yes. I mean, the ceremonies thing though is interesting because of course everybody wants, when they get married, everyone wants a wedding, you know, and everyone wants a funeral. But but I think it's an interesting thing. It's a transition is what you're describing. It's interesting. Yeah.
I think, Jeremy, you've hit on something which is very important here. I mean, just because more than 50% of the people don't identify with a religion, it doesn't mean they haven't got a morality. We have a morality, and this is evolved over time. I would go back to the Reformation, which was the first time that one religion couldn't determine the morality of society. And I believe that gradually over time, we have evolved a morality. I call it secular liberal humanism. Secular because it covers all religions. Liberal because it's based on ideas of of freedom and equality that was developed in Britain and the US in the 17th and 18th century. And humanist because it's rational, it's based on humanist behavior. And the first instance of this was the abolition of slavery. I mean, as far as I know, the Bible says, nothing in the Bible says slavery is a horrible thing and you shouldn't do it. But Christians, imbued with this new liberal ideas, decided that slavery was a bad thing. And certainly since the Second World War, we've changed as a society by absorbing humanist ideas. We've become a more caring society. We no longer demonize unmarried mothers, bastards, homosexuals. We've changed massively. And I think this is a huge opportunity for humanism. It's underplaying our role in the world. It's this, whatever you call it, this morality, these set of values, actually unites the whole of the Western world. It's happening in all the countries across the world at the same time.
Well, I think that's really, I mean, I'd like to think you were right, but you look at some of the stuff coming out of America.
Well, yeah, with the exception of America, there is a liberal part of America and a non-liberal part of America.
Yeah, yeah.
It certainly unites us across Europe and the liberal part of America. Yeah. And the other part of America has only grown up, I guess, in the last few years. But it's a very important morality, values, or set of values, or whatever you call it, that does unite us across national boundaries. It
does, yes, yes. But I think what's interesting is that there's always this, going back to the stats, you know, on the Catholic value thing, you know, there was sort of 30% who were stuck to the traditional values. And, you know, in society as a whole, I can't remember what the actual numbers are, people have done a lot of research on this. There is a certain percentage of people who don't share all of these values, you know, that have a different view of it. And to me, and that creates tension. We saw it, obviously, a lot of that was around, you know, Brexit had a lot of shadows of that. So to me, one of the big challenges, can you bridge that divide? Because that view isn't going to disappear.
Yeah, but is this any different? I mean, this has been evolving for decades. When we first approved marriage, you know, divorce, all the religious leaders were against it, and yet we approved it. You know, these things develop by consensus.
Yes.
And I don't see it any different now from what it has been in the past.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. I'm not quite as optimistic as that, but yeah.
Okay, social media has made it more difficult these days. But I mean, who would have ever believed that Ireland would vote for abortion and same-sex marriage?
Yeah, unbelievable.
I mean, that was absolutely, you couldn't even think about it 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, yeah, you're right.
Iman, you have a question, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. I think I will focus on the understated fact that you addressed in one of the slides, which is race, ethnicity, and other non-Christian groups. I think it makes sense. It's very logical that you expect increase in those groups, religious fundamental strength. And I think this is not something that can easily be addressed just by promoting common values. I think that's a very simplistic view of it. I think everything else makes sense. If we're talking about white European, it makes sense. The separation from church makes sense, that there's industrial revolution and we're becoming more independent, more individualistic, more free, more wealthy. And then, yeah, I have that freedom, that space to think outside of what's there in the Bible or what the church is telling me. But if you think about minorities, they're usually in a much lower, harsher socioeconomical conditions. Unfortunately, because of the liberal values, they have their own schools and they have their own teaching, so they're not really exposed to the common values or ideas. They are, because they live together and because they're in closed areas and because they're on their own schools, their system or their values are not as challenged. And I think that growth of, let's say, dominance of liberal white ideology threatens their identity. And hence, and that applies also to underprivileged white people, because those are the people who are becoming now Nazis, and they're becoming more Christian and becoming more fundamental. So I think there is a socioeconomic element that needs to be addressed, and there is a regulation element that needs to be addressed if we are to bring those lines closer to each other. Because what you will see is that whites are going up away from religion, but you will see religious minorities also becoming more fundamental. And
yes,
that's happening across the world. It's not a UK thing. So I don't think addressing the values element alone actually solves the problem.
I agree completely. I think that's what Linda Woodhead was trying to get at, was saying, when she was saying that, you know, we need to get better at talking across different value, you know, people holding different value sets, because we don't do that very well. And so what, you know, and so I agree that particularly you mentioned underprivileged, you know, if you look at data on kids, you know, the kids that are doing the worst in schools by any measure are white boys, you know, in deprived areas. So, so there's some big tensions there. And so, but instead of looking at it saying, well, that we should look at it in terms of talking across, you know, religions and beliefs, you know, that we knock on the door of the Catholic Church and say, let's have a dialogue. You know, that her implication is people who have, from a liberal background, whatever their ethnic background, but you know, what can we actually have a sensible exchange with people who don't hold liberal values and are not going to change their values? You know, I agree with you, you're not going to impose those values. So how do you learn to live together if you've got different sets of values? And that's one of the challenges. And we don't do that. We do tend to you know, demonize the other people. So it's unacceptable to hold a different value. It's something that you think, well, is an immoral value.
Isn't it a rather different thing, this ethnicity thing, though? Isn't it more having a sense of community for trying to preserve culture of different ethnic groups through their religion, rather than, I mean, you're talking about is that they're all going to go fundamental.
No.
If you looked at a Sikh or a Muslim congregation, wouldn't you have the same thing as you had with the Catholics, that some people,
of course you would,
some people don't believe all that sort of stuff? Isn't the fundamental reason why it's going ethnic is people like to preserve their own culture and go with their own people? That's not the same for the white group, because, you know, we're all in Britain, most of us in Britain are white, so we don't need this sense of community identity.
No, arguably, of course, that's something valuable that people say we've lost. Anyway, that's another issue. But no, I mean, I'm not implying that that ethnic minorities are more, extreme in their views. You're right that every group will have but it is true that if we take Christianity, the areas of biggest growth are African-based churches who do have basically where people do adhere to the values of the church, and those values are what you would call conservative values. Okay. Now, maybe you're quite right, Roger, that going back to the belief, belonging, and behaviour thing, that community is a hugely important thing, and I can completely understand, why that makes church going a very sticky thing for people in where if they find themselves in an ethnic minority, as I'm sure it would be if you were in a white minority in a majority different ethnicity. But it is true that where we're seeing growth in faith, particularly in Christianity, it is in those churches which have a more conservative advocate a more conservative set of values. Doesn't mean people are extremists, but they're more conservative on average. Everything's averages. There is a spectrum. There always is. But and as Emma, there's also among a lot of white British people, and when I was saying I wasn't as optimistic as Roger. A lot of the stuff you see at the moment, where values are very different to mine, for instance, are coming from white British people who are, say, much more right-wing, very anti-immigrant,
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why you're right that the fundamental differences between those who believe in liberal values and those who don't, and that is the major division in society today.
So if you can take, I don't know, a Sikh community, say, okay, Sikh's probably an easy one because they're by and large people who are quite liberally minded among the Sikh communities. Very good food, by the way, if you're going to Gurdwara. But there are hardline Sikhs, but the average Sikh you speak to who would have a dialogue with people like us are people who would share a lot of those liberal values and would actually have a big problem with their own fundamentalists.
Yeah.
Same applies to many people in the Muslim community who, I was talking to somebody last night who was actually, he was from Mauritania, he's, Muslim guy, and he was talking about, how difficult when 9/11 happened, and he was living in this country. And he just said, I just looked at complete incomprehension. He said, this was so far away from everything I've been taught in my faith since childhood. I just didn't understand it, and yet people saw me as a Muslim, and then I became an object of suspicion, and so, but he would have as strong an argument with the people at the fundamentalist arm of Islam, much more stronger argument than he would with you or me,
Yeah.
But I think you're right that Roger and Emma said that we're people, and community things are really, really important. It goes back to what I was saying about the people from the Association of Black Humanists, that when you talk to them, that actually going out on a limb and say, well, actually, not only do I have these values, but actually I'm going to change my identity. I'm not going to identify as a liberal-minded Seventh-day Adventist. I'm going to identify as a humanist. So they've gone, that's really hard. That's really hard. And it's much, much harder than it is for someone like me. Much harder. And I think that's why we should, those best we can do is try and understand that and give people the support they can and listen to them, because I can never have that experience. I just can't.
Yeah, I was at a liberal video link like this the other day, and a Muslim wouldn't identify his surname because he didn't want to be seen as humanist by his Muslim colleagues. So,
right, really.
The same sort of worry occurs.
Yeah, it's particularly hard there. That's where you're having the ex-Muslim thing is that's very tough, and hopefully we'll mature out of that a little bit. But yeah, that's a particularly difficult thing. Same with ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, same with ex-ultra-Orthodox Jews, have exactly the same problems. If you talk with people in faith to faithless, they have personally have a very hard time.
Yeah,
Slightly different to what we're talking about. It's not so much values, but that's about family relations. Yeah.
We had a very good talk on faith to faithless a couple of months ago.
Very good. You? Well, who did you have?
Imtiaz Shams was.
Imtiaz, right, yeah. Imtiaz is a good guy.
And it's recorded. It's on our YouTube channel. Very worth well watching if you didn't.
Oh, great. Okay. Good, yeah.
Can I make a point, or in fact 2 points? One of the problems with religion is it's part of people's cultural identity. So it's not about beliefs or values even. It's just to say that I belong to this group. One of the things happened after the Reformation, that being a foreigner meant you were a Catholic, and most of our enemies were foreigners. So being Catholic was not a good thing, and being a Protestant was a good thing. The other thing I think is, and I think is very interesting in your talk about the importance of values. I was very intrigued by being involved in a thing where we used to rehearse on a Saturday morning in this primary school, and the walls screamed values at us. Whereas if you go into a church, certainly a Church of England church, you haven't got a clue what the values are, what they actually promote. There's a lot of statements about beliefs. I mean, if you look at the creeds, none of the creeds talk about values.
No.
If you believe in the communion of let's say the resurrection of the, I've forgotten them all now, suddenly, none of them have any suggestion of values. Which I think is interesting, because if you ask Christians, I was at a meeting the other day with a bishop and an archdeacon, and I asked them, what are Christian values? And they couldn't answer it quickly. And what they came up with is the great quote, greater love hath no man than he gave up his life. Now, once in a lifetime value system, because they can only do it once. What about the ones where you have to sort of do them daily, And I thought that was very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
And I think the other interesting thing about values is that you can evaluate them as to their merits. What are the advantages of being benevolent and all the rest of it? You can see that they have benefit. There's a spin-off. There's advantage both to the individual and to the collective if you possess certain values. And I think values becomes a kind of neutral zone where you can have this discussion, because if you're asking someone to believe, do you believe that Christ is the Son of God? I mean, you can't get very far apart from where's your evidence, or
there's no point in having that.
Whereas with values, you can articulate why a particular value should be amongst it, and also you can compete against, see that some values, let's say obedience. Obedience is an interesting one. You can see obedience is a wonderful value, but if you're obeying to doing something that's really not very nice, like an SS colonel and all the rest of it, you might think, actually, obedience is not all it's cracked up to be, because you have to make a moral judgment about the merit of the thing you are obeying. So, I mean, there's lots of areas in which you can have discussion and help people articulate why they have values. Whereas I think with faith issues, you just got to do it by faith, as a sort of statement. That was conviction politics. Rather.
If you want to have an interesting, if slightly intellectual discussion, what you can do is talk about, how does your beliefs lead you to your values? That's an interesting thing. So, you know, so you could, even on a hot topic like, I don't know, if you talked with I was going to say Catholics I know who are theologians who are, you know, very strongly against abortion, say, there's no point in having a discussion about is abortion, you know, should it be allowed or not. Everybody knows what their position is on it. What is interesting is saying, well, you know, how do you arrive at the position that you have on the basis of your beliefs, you know, and then you get an interesting discussion, you know, but it's a slightly intellectual thing. But can I just pick you up on something you said right at the beginning, which is about the community thing and how that was, I think that the relative importance of that varies a lot, and easy to generalize about it, but I don't think we should, that if you take, I don't know, Judaism, you know, there's, I guess everybody here knows David Baddiel, you know David Baddiel? Yeah. He's one of Humanists UK's patrons, comedian.
Yeah.
He's written, he wrote a book a couple of years ago called Jews Don't Count, which is a bestseller. Anyway, if you look at his Twitter profile, he has one word Twitter profile and it says Jew on it. That's it. Now, he's a patron of Humanists UK. And he's an atheist. But his cultural identity is very strongly as being Jewish. The belief thing doesn't count for him at all, you know. And I doubt whether he sets foot inside a synagogue from one year to the next. But that's his cultural identity. So that's very much in line with what Paul was saying in a way. And you know, and it also means people often defy being put into boxes. You know, is he a humanist? Is he a Jew? Who cares, really? He's him, you know. But then there are other people for whom the belief bit, and you know, like I was talking again at this event last night, somebody who had a very traumatic childhood and things, and for him, and he's now a vicar in the Church of England, and his personal relationship with God is the thing that drives his life. That's the big thing for him in his whole life. You know? And that's quite a profound thing, you know, explain why it was. And you think, well, you can't knock that, you know, he went through some very, very tough things, and that's how he came out of it. And so for him, it is important. It's not just the community. He would be having that view if he was on his own in a desert island, you know. So I think people are very, very, very a lot in that, in the levels of their personal conviction and the commitment to their beliefs. You know, and I've learned you can't, you know, you've almost got to go down to the level of the individual to find out, just to ask people. Varies hugely, you know. But his values were the same as mine, basically.
Yeah. Jeremy, I have another observation just from my personal experience. I spent a lot of years working in large American multinational companies in the IT industry. And every time we ever put a management team together, we would start off with, we had to have a vision, and the second thing we would have would be values, and there would be a discussion. And the list of values, you know, there was a few would go in and out, but it was a very core and common set of values. And there was never any connotation of religion about where the values had come from. In fact, it was completely the opposite. It was implicit that religion and politics would not directly come into the conversation. These were all values about people, about ethical things, about how you conduct business, how you treat people, and so on. And the kind of things we would have is, I can remember having training. I went on a one-day training course on diversity and inclusion, and I've always been you know, anti-racist, but when I went to the course, I assumed that's what it would be about, and actually it was very much broader than that. It got down to discussing things like women when they have children, and how do we make sure that when they return to work, they're included. There was a whole range of things. So these discussions, I think, are happening very widely in our society, and they become, by their nature, divorced from religion, and to a large degree from politics. There is a political dimension in them. You know, the culture wars, as I can't remember what you said the woman's name was that did the research, but
Linda Woodhead.
Linda Woodhead, yeah. The culture wars she refers to, and a lot of that has been a backlash from some people that don't like some of these value discussions and the liberal values that are entailed. But it seems to me, as humanists, getting engaged with those conversations and being part of them is important, because they are going on in society, and they continue to develop, but they are quite advanced in lots of areas of society.
If you look at the Linda Woodhead's lectures, she does talk a lot, because I used to work in a big global multinational as well, just the same, you know, you have various statements, and to some extent they were, sometimes it was a tick in the box, you know, we've got to do is mission, you know, vision and values. Have we done the mission? All right, now let's get on with the work, you know, sort of thing. But actually underneath it, you knew that there was some real, because you ended up spending ages arguing about these things. I don't know about you, because you know, but she talks quite a lot about that, because, you know, corporate values, that they sound, you know, you think people are very cynical about them, but actually they're quite reflective of some real things going on, because corporations are comprised of real people who bring themselves, if they're doing their job properly, they bring themselves to work, you know, and so I think you're right. I agree completely with that. Yeah.
And the piece that always struck me about it was the biggest challenge of a multinational company is to get people from very diverse backgrounds to be able to work together, to be comfortable to work together, confident, and not have any impediments from prejudices. That's what an awful lot of this was about, to make sure that the companies I worked in, nearly all of them had started out in places with strong Christian values and a strong Christian ethic, but had developed into this very secular approach.
Yeah.
Which, as soon as you move outside of the US, if you're going to grow as a company, you must have to do. You're going to prosper otherwise.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. It's a must. It's not a choice, really, when you're an international organization, no. Unless you're going to deny yourself all the smart people. You know, I remember, you know, somebody I came across, you know, she was, you know, a geoengineer, I think, you know, from Oman, hijab wearing, you know, and you miss that person if you didn't have a correct set of liberal values. And she was really smart, you know.
So I do have a question, Jeremy, given the question you posed at the end, which was in a way a bit of a provocation.
Yeah.
How do you see that discussion moving forward in terms of how this affects Humanists UK and the kind of things that Humanists UK campaigns on and presents itself as?
Well, I mean, I think we are Humanists UK. We are humanists, aren't we? So what I wanted to do is get people to think about and discuss these things, and that they were, I mean, obviously some of the stuff, if you look at what Humanists UK does, a lot of these are, you know, they're very hard-edged campaigns that you can get your arms around, if you like. There is obviously a lot of value stuff going on, which is supported by Humanists UK, but they're not, you know, you can't say that's a campaign. And there are some hot issues, like I don't think you'll find a humanist campaign about trans rights, because it's going to be too controversial among humanists to do. So, but I think the bit that I'm interested in, obviously we're doing a lot more on dialogue than we used to do. I think that is a way in which we can extend this thinking. And but beyond that, I'm be honest with you, I haven't got a good answer to your question. I haven't got a grand plan. And if I had, I'm sure Andrew would put me back in my box very quickly.
Well, I suppose we hadn't actually mentioned education much, but that's another topic.
Yes.
Well, anyway, thank you very much, Jeremy. That was a really good. Sorry, go on, Paul.
we had a nice talk a couple of years ago, Andrew, if you remember, when we were meeting in pubs and nice things. We had a lady, I think she was from Exeter, talking about rituals in humanist circles, and was it a thing that, you know, disadvantaged humanists not having rituals or being associated with not. I think rituals are very important psychological events that it'd be worth, I think, humanists devoting attention to, because people like an event to mark things like birth, marriages and deaths, and getting that right for the individual, for the people, I think is very important. I mean, I went to a funeral last week, and it was a mess. It was a kind of psychological mess, because it tried to be a kind of old-fashioned Christian funeral, Church of England one, but other things as well, and it ended up being sort of nothing. And I think understanding these rituals, which I would say there's a psychological need for, but getting it right would be, I think, or helping people to get it right would be an important thing to do, because we all get, well, we don't all get married, but we certainly all die. So funerals definitely are something need to get right, as well as the other end, you know. I know they have baby showers and all these sorts of amazing things that have crept into our culture in recent times. But I think that just shows that people want or feel a need to mark these occasions with an event. And I think helping people or decide how they can mark these, it would be a serious contribution.
Right, well, on that note, we're almost finished. I'm just going to put a note in the chat about our next talk, which is by Professor Chris French. And he's called it 20 Years of Weird Science at Goldsmiths. He was a professor of abnormal psychology. That should be good fun. And that's 26th of April. It's again the fourth, I think the fourth Tuesday in the month, that's right. Same thing, Zoom, 7 p.m. And I'm just going to put a link on there in case you're interested in that, but you don't need to follow that link. You can just go on Chichester Humanists or Humanists UK and have a look at it. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Great.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's very good.
Oh,
And thank
good
you
discussion.
And thank you for everyone making really good points and raising those questions. And yeah, hope to see you next time.